filled the space between the words. "The day I told James I was pregnant," Sarah continued, her voice fragile. "He didn't say a thing. He just knelt, kissed my belly, and hugged Duke. He said, 'Looks like you've got one more to protect now.'" She smiled through the tremble in her lips, a smile so faint it seemed to dissolve into the memory itself. But James never came back after that last mission. I never got a final hug, no goodbye, just a badge, a small photo, and Duke's old collar. He died when I was 6 months pregnant. Claire leaned forward, resting her hand gently over Sarah's. That hand was thin, nails cracked from cold, but clenched tightly now, like if she let go, the last fragile pieces of her might fall apart. "I didn't cry," Sarah said, her voice now hoarse, like wind whispering through the hollow of a cave. "Not because I was strong. I was empty. I spent every day in that house staring at the empty crib, listening to the clock tick, and just trying to keep Tyler safe inside me. I couldn't even let myself imagine giving birth alone. But Duke, he never left me." She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with Claire. Her voice cracked again. "That dog, Claire, he was the last piece of James I had left. I stayed up all night, every night. I thought about giving up, more than once, but whenever I fell asleep on the couch, Duke would quietly lie down at my feet, rest his head near mine, and sometimes just gently lick my hand. No barking, no whining. Not one night did he leave. Only Duke stayed." Claire squeezed her hand gently, eyes shining with tears she didn't try to hide. Ryan remained quiet, his gaze lowered to the floor, though he wasn't looking at anything in particular. In that moment, the silence in the ambulance wasn't empty. It was full of grief, love, and something no one could name. Sarah lightly touched the edge of the blanket wrapped around her, as if searching for a trace of old warmth left behind from another life. "But life didn't get any kinder," she whispered. "No job, no family, no one was nearby. Then the house started to fall apart, leaking roof, broken phone. I wanted to ask for help but didn't even know where to start. Every time I failed, I'd just hold my baby close and sit in the dark. And then, when Tyler's fever wouldn't break, I knew. I didn't have the strength left to keep him alive. I had nothing left to give. But Duke still did." She bit her lip, her gaze locking with Claire's. "That's why I let him go. It wasn't that I gave up on my son, it's that I believed if anyone could make it through that storm to save Tyler, it would be Duke. I gave him everything I had left. My whole life was in that choice." Claire couldn't find words. The tears had come quietly, mixed with the sound of the rain, blurring with the ambulance lights outside the window. She squeezed Sarah's hand again, not to reassure her, but to hold herself together. And Duke, still seated at the back of the ambulance, his body trembling with each gust of cold wind from the doorframe, didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed, guarding the fragile thread of what mattered most. A story of love, of loyalty, of a spirit that would not break, told through eyes that needed no translation, yet carved themselves into the heart forever. The ambulance siren echoed long and steady through the rain that hadn't yet let up. As the vehicle turned into the rear entrance of the hospital, its tires skimmed across the slick pavement, water spraying like gray ribbons beneath the emergency lights. Claire sat close to Sarah, her hand still resting on the woman's shoulder, steadying her through not only the physical storm they had just escaped, but the emotional one of loss, fear, and faith almost extinguished. Sarah was quickly taken to treatment. Her body was showing signs of collapse, lowered temperature, pale lips, a weak pulse, and early symptoms of hypothermia in her lungs. But her eyes remained alert, darting toward every corridor, trying to sit up whenever she heard footsteps, desperate to ask about her child. Claire had to calm her again and again, assuring her that Tyler was safe, that he was still in the incubator, being carefully monitored, that he had made it, thanks to her, and thanks to Duke. As for Duke, his steps slower now, the blood at his paw finally dried and wrapped. He still followed silently behind Sarah's stretcher, eyes never leaving her. When the nurses finally brought him into the veterinary room for treatment, Duke paused. He turned his head, glancing back toward the ER as if to confirm she would be all right. Claire saw that look, the look of someone who had spent his life protecting, someone who knew what it meant to risk himself for others, and she gave him a quiet nod. That was all it took. Duke turned and followed the nurse. But just as Claire was about to turn back toward the recovery ward, a voice cut through the air, cold, dry, and sharp as a blade slicing through the fragile quiet. "I think we may have let emotion drive our decisions too far, Claire." Linda. She stood near the divider pole in the corridor, her hair still damp and clinging to both sides of her face, her uniform streaked with rain that hadn't yet dried. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze wasn't on Sarah, or the baby clinging to life down the hall. It was fixed squarely on the last door, where the German shepherd now rested after being bandaged. And in her eyes, there was no trace of compassion, only suspicion, rigid, defensive suspicion, the kind worn by someone who had never been ready to forgive. Claire turned back slowly. She knew that look all too well, but now, after everything that had happened, that same look felt colder than ever. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, voice calm but steady. Linda took a step forward, her posture tightening as though preparing for a formal inquiry. "I'm saying that letting a dog, even a canine, lead a police officer and a nurse out of a hospital in the middle of a storm to find someone sounds so irrational that I honestly have to ask, who exactly was making the decisions? Us or the dog?" Claire's hand curled slightly, but Linda wasn't finished. "I understand everyone's emotional. A baby was saved. A mother barely made it. I'm not denying the result. But don't tell me this all happened because of that dog. Come on. This was police work. This was logical deduction, human instinct, not some miracle performed by an aging, injured, retired animal that suddenly turned into a hero in a rainstorm." Linda still remembered the terrifying fragments of her past, memories she'd tried to bury but never quite escaped. They were always tied to one creature: dogs. It had been an ordinary afternoon, just like any other. She was walking with her mother to the post office, passing by the neighbor's yard. Just once, only once, her mother forgot to bring the letter. Linda offered to run back and get it. That's when it happened. No warning bark, no growl, just the black dog next door, twice her tiny size, bursting out from behind the gate like an arrow loosed from a bow. Linda didn't even have time to scream. All she saw were its yellowed eyes, flashing teeth, and then pain, sharp and searing, tearing through her calf. She fell to the ground, her hand soaked in blood. 12 stitches. One night in the hospital, and nearly 40 years of fear that never quite went away. It wasn't the wound that haunted her. It was the helplessness, the realization that something so powerful could harm her without a reason, without warning. "Linda!" Claire stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "I saw him when he came through the doors, soaked, trembling and carrying that bundle. That wasn't instinct. That was trained response. Years of work, discipline, purpose. I saw his eyes when that baby was being resuscitated. I followed him, through flooded streets, past a speeding truck that nearly killed us, and in the end, he brought us to where the mother had collapsed." Linda pressed her lips together. Claire continued, unable now to hold back the emotion rising in her voice. "We talk about humanity all the time, but when a dog, just because he can't speak, is doubted more than he's trusted, then maybe the thing we need to re-examine isn't the dog, it's us." Linda said nothing. She turned away, her expression no longer sharp, but not softened enough to admit she was wrong. Not yet. Claire didn't press further. She turned and headed toward the neonatal ward. Sarah had been given fluids and allowed to rest, but the moment she could stand, she insisted on seeing Tyler. Claire personally walked her to the NICU. The room glowed in sterile white, quiet and cold, the incubator in the center holding Tyler. So small, his tiny arms twitching with each shallow breath, wrapped in a blanket, a delicate tube feeding oxygen through his nose. Sarah froze at the doorway. Her feet wouldn't move another inch. Her entire body trembled, close to collapsing. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Only when Claire gently took her hand and led her forward. Only then did Sarah fall to her knees. And the first sob broke free. "My baby! Mommy's here!" She reached out, fingertips barely touching the glass of the incubator, as if afraid that one wrong move might make the fragile shape inside disappear like smoke. She whispered the same words over and over, not for Tyler to hear, but to convince herself that he was real, that he was still here, that he was breathing. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. I'm sorry I let you go alone." Claire stood behind her, her hand still resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder. In that moment, she realized that nothing she had ever learned in medical school, none of the textbooks, none of the lectures, could ever define the worth of what was unfolding in front of her. Duke, now cleaned, bandaged, and allowed into the room by special request from the chief physician, walked in slowly. He lay down beside Sarah, resting his head gently by her feet, his eyes fixed on the incubator. No barking, no movement, just quiet presence. Steady, unwavering, the kind of presence only true heroes carry, the ones who ask for nothing in return. Sarah reached down and placed a hand on Duke's head. "Thank you. Thank you for not leaving my son. Thank you for not leaving me." And for the first time since they arrived at the hospital, Claire saw Linda, the unshakable nurse, standing silently behind the glass wall, her eyes slightly red, her hands clenched around a file folder, now wrinkled from the pressure. Sometimes people don't need miracles. Sometimes they just need a dog who knows the way home through a storm, and a faith that never gave up. Beneath the soft white glow cast from the ceiling lights of the neonatal intensive care unit, the air in the room felt thick, so still that the only sound was the faint beeping of the monitor tracking Tyler's fragile heartbeat. Each pulse was a threadbare breath, a whisper of life clinging to the edge. Claire stood quietly beside the incubator, her eyes never leaving the tiny body lying within it. He was swaddled in soft fabric, wearing a small white and blue newborn cap. His face was still pale, but his breathing had steadied. The worst had passed, but the minutes ahead remained a brutal fight for survival. At the door, Duke was guided in by a young nurse, his wounds now cleaned and neatly bandaged. The cut on his paw had stopped bleeding, though the bandage showed faint traces of dried blood. His eyes, however, were clear, clearer than they'd ever been. No one called him. No one gave a command. And yet, Duke walked forward, each step slow, deliberate, and full of reverence, as if crossing into the most sacred ground of his life. The room, silent only seconds before, seemed to hold its breath as the dog approached. Claire bent down, gently placed a hand on his head, and whispered, almost like a prayer, "Go on, buddy." Duke tilted his head, a gesture that felt like a nod, then stepped up to the incubator. He didn't bark. He didn't paw. He simply placed both front paws lightly against the glass and tilted his head, gazing inside. No one said a word. Time seemed to pause. And then, something no one expected happened. Tyler stirred. A tiny arm moved. His fingers curled, then slowly unfurled, reaching for something invisible. A faint, fragile sound escaped his lips, more like a sigh than a cry, but it was unmistakable. Duke blinked once, then lowered his cheek gently against the cold glass. His expression softened. He no longer looked like the storm-worn soldier who had battled through wind and rain. In that moment, he looked like a father, a companion, a soul who had known loss, and was now willing to love again. At the far end of the room, Linda stood in shadow, where the light only barely reached. Her hands were clenched tightly together. Her eyes moved between Duke, Tyler, and the quiet, unwavering gaze that passed between them. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't let herself feel in decades. The memory returned. 8 years old, the scar, the screaming, the helpless fear as a dog attacked her, and no one came to her defense. She'd worn that fear like armor ever since, using it to keep herself safe from ever trusting again. But here, right in front of her, was a dog who had walked through a storm to save a child. A dog who hadn't asked questions, hadn't needed praise, who simply went and did what had to be done, because of a promise to someone no longer here. And now he was waking a fragile soul from the edge of silence, with just a look. Inside the incubator, Tyler began to open his eyes. He turned his head slightly toward Duke, as if he recognized him. And to him, Duke wasn't a stranger. Duke had heard his heartbeat from inside the womb, had kept vigil by his crib on sleepless nights, had felt the gentle kicks of Tyler's tiny feet pressing against his side when Sarah leaned against Duke, rocking her baby to sleep. Now, all those memories, all that silent love, were forming a bond no language could describe. Claire bent down again, resting her hand on Duke's shoulder. "You're the only one who could do this," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up." Duke didn't respond, but when he leaned forward and gently licked the glass, right where Tyler had turned to face him, Claire knew. He had heard her, and that he would continue to do the only thing Duke had ever known how to do: protect the child, until he no longer needed protecting. Now that the storm had passed, Sarah sat quietly beside her son's bed, her hand resting gently on the blanket draped across Tyler's chest. It had been so long since she last sat in a space that felt warm and safe, free from the sound of wind and rain pounding against broken windows, free from the howling that used to slip through the cracks of rotted walls like a scream echoing into her loneliness. The storm had long withdrawn, but its echoes still lingered deep in Sarah's chest. In the corner of the room, Duke lay curled on a thin towel Claire had laid out for him. Though his injured leg still throbbed, he made no sound of discomfort, no demand for care. He simply breathed steadily, ears perked just enough to catch every small movement Tyler made. Each time the baby exhaled harder or whimpered faintly in his sleep, Duke would lift his head, eyes darting toward the incubator, as if to ask, "Is something wrong? Do you need me?" Sarah turned to look at the dog, her throat tightening. In that moment, the memories came rushing back. Those first days after James died, the endless nights that stretched out with no end in sight, and the image of Duke, patient, quiet, and always there, like a familiar shadow that never left her side. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift backward into those early, broken days. The ones where, had it not been for Duke, she might not have had the strength to still be here, to sit and watch her son breathing, safe and warm in this incubator. It had been a bone-chilling winter evening, the sky blanketed in gray that hung over the city like the weight of her grief after the call from the military hospital. James's death certificate lay in her hands, pale and lifeless like a sheet of paper without a soul. All sound seemed to die. She returned home, didn't turn on the lights, didn't change clothes, didn't eat. She simply sat there, in the dark, cold room, motionless, silent, empty. She couldn't cry. The pain was too immense for tears. Her heart just kept twisting, every beat like a scream echoing inside her chest. Then came the sound of footsteps. Soft, barely there. Not human. Not someone coming to offer comfort. It was Duke, the same dog who had stood beside James through battlefields and long deployments, still wearing his dusty canine collar, walking slowly toward her. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't scratch the door or do anything to demand attention. He simply walked to her, sat down, and gently rested his heavy head on her knee. That small gesture, wordless and still, shattered the ice that had formed around her heart. Sarah broke down, sobbing, not because James was gone, but because Duke was still there. Because in a world where every foundation had collapsed, this dog was the one thing left standing. A silent affirmation that said, "You are not alone." The days that followed blurred together in a numb haze. She was 6 months pregnant, alone, drained and constantly teetering on the edge between survival and surrender. Each morning, when her eyes opened, she didn't see sunlight. She didn't find loving notes from James like she used to. She saw Duke, always waiting at her bedroom door, quiet and still, wagging his tail just enough to say, "I'm still here. We're still here." Then came Tyler. So small, so fragile, she barely dared to touch him. She wasn't ready. She was still hurting, still scared, still hollowed out and unsure if she had anything left to give. But once again, Duke stepped in, filling the gaps where she couldn't yet reach. On those nights when Tyler cried endlessly and Sarah collapsed in exhaustion, it was Duke's ears, always alert, that never rested. At the slightest whimper, Duke would rise, approach the crib, and let out a soft bark, just one, enough to wake Sarah, or sometimes simply stand guard until the baby settled again. One night, Sarah woke to a faint sound. She looked over and saw Duke, gently nudging a thin blanket over Tyler's belly with his nose. That gesture, it wasn't training. It wasn't instinct from obedience school. It was something else. It was love. It was connection. It was the instinct of a creature who understood, deep in his being, that this little life was all that remained of his fallen partner, and that, whatever it took, it must be protected. Sarah had never believed a dog could understand all of that, until she saw it with her own eyes. Slowly, she began to place her trust in him. She let Duke sit beside her while she nursed her son, allowed him to rest near the crib as Tyler slept, and brought him along through nights filled with tears and dreams haunted by James. Every evening, before she went to bed, Duke would quietly patrol the house, checking the corners, the windows, the front door, as if he were still on duty, guarding this tiny home just like he once did beside James in the field. Then came a night of violent rain and wind. The roof leaked. Tyler was only 3 weeks old, shivering and crying non-stop. Sarah tried to move the crib to a drier corner but slipped, nearly falling. In that instant, Duke rushed in. He moved behind her, bracing her with his shoulder, using his body as a support to keep her steady. No barking, no hesitation, no command needed. He simply acted, as if he had vowed, silently, never to let this family fall. And in that moment, she felt as if James was still watching over her from somewhere far away, smiling. And Duke, he was no longer just a retired K9 dog who had once gone to battle. He was a fragment of the man she had loved, a witness, a companion, a protector, family, nothing more, nothing less. Now, in the quiet hospital room, as Sarah watched Duke lying in his familiar protective stance, she couldn't help but lift a hand to cover her eyes. The tears fell quietly onto her cheeks, worn and shadowed from so many sleepless nights. Tyler was being cared for. She was still alive. And all of it, everything, was because of that dog, the last friend from the past who had never left her behind. "James," she whispered, voice breaking like a prayer, "you left me the most incredible thing. I thought I couldn't go on, but Duke, he kept our family together. Do you see him? He's still here?" Duke stirred slightly, his eyes opening to meet hers. And in that look, Sarah felt certain he understood. He stood slowly, walked to the bedside, and gently laid his chin on the edge of the mattress. No urgency, no demand, just presence, quiet and warm. Sarah leaned down, her fingers brushing through the fur atop Duke's head. It was so familiar it ached. Beneath her hand, she felt the fur beginning to gray around his ears, traces of time and battles, not just on the field, but within the hearts of those who remained behind. "He's our family," she said softly, as if affirming something not only to herself, but to the entire world. And in that room, where the monitors hummed with the slow return of a heartbeat, and a baby's breaths grew stronger with every passing hour, life was held not by science alone, but by something far older and deeper: love, loyalty, and the silent, unwavering presence of a creature once trained to fight, who had instead chosen to win by loving. Beneath the soft golden light of the recovery room, Duke still lay silently along the hallway, like a quiet sentinel watching over the fragile thread of life being held together minute by minute. The nurses passing by had grown used to his presence. Some would pause for a moment to gently stroke his back. Others simply gave him a small nod, an unspoken thank you. The feeling slowly spread, quiet but steady, like a soft breeze seeping into the corners of a place once ruled by machines and clinical protocols. And yet, not everyone could accept it so easily. Some beliefs take time to take root. Some wounds, buried deep, still needed healing before hearts could open. Since the tense argument with Claire, Linda hadn't spoken another word about the dog, nor had anyone seen her approach Duke again. Every time she passed him, she kept her distance, eyes avoiding the creature that stirred not only suspicion within her, but also something else: fear. To her, Duke was still an enigma, a quiet, unshakable presence that challenged her on a level she didn't quite understand. She didn't deny that he'd saved Tyler, but somewhere inside, there remained a blurry discomfort. Can a dog really understand and act like that? Or was it all just a coincidence? Then one night, when the hospital had slipped into its quietest hour, Linda made her routine check of the oxygen system and heart monitor for a newborn in the NICU. Baby Grace, born at only 28 weeks, still clinging to each breath in a battle against death. The oxygen control room was at the end of the hallway, just to the right of where Duke usually rested since he'd been bandaged. Linda walked in, her tired eyes scanning the digital readout. Grace's vitals were stable. She exhaled, relieved, and slid her pen back into her breast pocket. But then a sound, subtle, unlike any machine, broke the silence behind her. The click of dog nails on tile. She turned around. Duke was standing there. No one knew how long he'd been there. His back was damp again, breath steady, eyes fixed on the closed door ahead. Linda squinted, her heartbeat tightening. She didn't speak, but her body instinctively took a step back. That old fear from childhood sparked in her chest. And yet, Duke didn't come closer. He simply raised his head and let out a low growl, not threatening, but a warning. Linda hesitated, then turned back to the monitor. Everything still looked normal. She frowned, stepped in to double-check the oxygen tubes. All fine. She shook her head, ready to walk away when, beep, beep, beep! A piercing alarm shrieked from the screen. Linda froze. Her heart missed a beat. She darted toward the console just as Duke growled louder and suddenly lunged forward. The door hadn't been locked. He crashed through it, using his full weight, and let out a long, heart-wrenching howl, one that echoed down the hall, cutting through the silence like a blade. That howl caught the attention of the night shift team on the far side of the ward. Within 30 seconds, the emergency response crew arrived. As doctors began chest compressions and worked to resecure Grace's airway, Linda stood frozen in the corner, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the monitor she was holding. Cold sweat clung to her forehead, not from fatigue, but from the terrifying truth that settled deep inside her. If it hadn't been for Duke, if not for that cry, Grace might not have made it. Under the stark white light of the NICU, amidst the beeping machines and rushed orders, Linda turned to look at Duke. He had stepped back, standing just outside the door, but his eyes never left the tiny infant still fighting for her life. There was no more suspicion, no more guardedness. In that gaze was something pure, concern, protection, and most of all, understanding. The kind of understanding no creature should have, unless it carried in its chest a heart capable of love. That night, Linda didn't sleep. She sat in the break room, one hand wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. She thought about the scar that still marked her thigh, the terrifying memory from childhood that had taught her to always fear dogs. But now, the only image playing on a loop in her mind was Duke's drenched figure crashing into that NICU room like a soldier, and the sound of that haunting, urgent howl as if trying to shake the whole world awake. The next morning, during the hospital's daily briefing, Linda was the first to raise her hand. Her voice was calm, neither loud nor soft, but carried a firmness that turned every head in the room. "I'd like to propose we install a plaque right in the main hallway," she said. "It should read, 'Duke, Hero of the Storm.'" For a moment, the entire room fell silent. Claire looked at her, surprised, almost not believing what she'd just heard. Linda, the very person who once insisted on having Duke removed from the hospital, the one who questioned his every action, was now the first to speak up. Linda slowly turned to Claire. She didn't smile, but in her eyes was a different kind of light. "Maybe I was wrong, and if anyone deserves to be remembered for that stormy night, it's that dog." Claire gave a small nod, then stood up. And amid the many faces now looking at each other, moved and wordless, there was one gaze in the corner of the room. Duke's, calm, unexpecting, quietly watching, as if everything he had done, from beginning to end, was for one simple reason. It was the right thing to do. The storm had passed. The rain and wind that once blanketed the city now remained only in thin puddles on the streets, mirroring clouds that still lingered above. The hospital, too, was returning to its normal rhythm. But for those who had witnessed Duke's journey, from the moment he walked through the main doors with a fragile life clenched gently in his jaws, to the instant he alerted the staff just in time to save another child, nothing felt quite normal anymore. Something had shifted, something deep. Tyler was discharged on Monday morning. He was still weak, but his heartbeat was steady, his body temperature had stabilized, and his eyes, barely open, were enough to make Sarah break down in joyful tears. She held him in her arms with a tenderness that suggested she was cradling her entire world. Claire stood beside her, resting a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and smiling softly. "This little boy's a fighter, and so is his mom." Duke walked beside them, his pace steady, the white bandage still wrapped neatly around his hind leg. Each step now carried more than just weight. It carried the quiet reverence of every staff member he passed. Even Linda, no longer avoiding his gaze, gave a small nod when their eyes met. Sarah was leaving the hospital with Tyler, but not with ease in her heart. Because outside the hospital's warm walls, life was just as harsh as before. She had no stable job. Most of the savings she and James had tucked away had been drained. First by the delivery, then by the early days of raising a child alone. This hospital bill, though partially covered by assistance, was still overwhelming. Sarah sat in a quiet corner of the hallway, holding the invoice in her hands, feeling her chest cave in. She couldn't pay it. Not anytime soon, but her son, her miracle, needed formula, diapers, a home without a leaking roof, and she had nothing left. Claire walked over and sat beside her. "We're going to help," she said, soft but firm. "Not just me, everyone who's witnessed what you've been through." Sarah looked up, her eyes glassy. "But I can't—" "Sarah," Claire interrupted gently, "you don't have to apologize for surviving. You don't have to feel guilty for needing help. We all fall. What matters is who helps us get back up." And Claire kept her word. That same afternoon, during the staff briefing, she stood up and shared the full story of Duke. Not as some miraculous tale of a remarkable dog, but as a testament to loyalty, love, and the unbreakable strength of a mother named Sarah. She called on the hospital community, nurses, doctors, volunteers, technicians, to come together. A small fund was established, named Hero of the Storm, not to glorify, but to act. Within 3 days, dozens had joined in. A resident doctor donated a large box of diapers and baby formula. A young nurse passed down the crib her son had outgrown. A maintenance worker gave a modest envelope of cash with a note. "I was a kid raised by the kindness of strangers. I hope little Tyler gets that too." The story of Duke and Sarah didn't stay within hospital walls. A local journalist, visiting his mother in recovery, heard about it and asked for permission to publish. By morning, the article, "The Dog in the Storm, A Journey of Loyalty," had gone viral. Not because it was sensational, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real and deeply moving. The story touched thousands of hearts. People didn't just comment and share, they acted. A baby goods company sent a delivery truck to the hospital filled with supplies: strollers, warm blankets, soft toys. A single mother support organization offered to cover Sarah's living expenses for the next 6 months. And most unexpected of all, a small but solid house, complete with electricity, water, and storm-proof roofing, was gifted to her by a family whose lives had once been saved by a K9 unit during a house fire 3 years ago. But the biggest surprise came from the hospital itself. The HR director approached Sarah personally. "We'd like to offer you a part-time role in our administrative support department," she said. "Flexible hours. We'll make sure it works with your schedule as a new mom. You have calmness, a persistence, qualities we really need here." Sarah was stunned. She had thought her road ahead would be steep and unforgiving. But now, hands were reaching out to lift her up. And at that same time, another set of footsteps, soft, steady, and silent, also stepped into a new journey. Not of a human, but of a dog. Though the story of the storm had begun to fade, the name Duke remained, not just in the memories of those who had witnessed his extraordinary journey, but lingering down the hospital corridors, etched into each sterile white bed, quietly living in the hearts of patients who once thought hope had left them behind. At first, Duke's continued presence after the ordeal seemed like a touching gesture, an emotional tribute to the miracle he had brought. But over time, through his quiet footsteps and ever-watchful eyes, people began to realize that what Duke had left behind was greater than any miracle. It was trust, a trust that needed no proof, no justification, just presence, solid, gentle, and whole, like the way he once cradled Tyler, stood guard beside the crib night after night, and led a whole family back from the brink of despair. 1 week after Tyler and Sarah were discharged, a nameplate was officially mounted at the corner of the third-floor hallway. Duke, Special Support Staff. Just below it hung a small hook, holding a wristband embroidered with the words, "Healing, not just barking." It had started as a joke from head nurse Claire, but somehow became the unofficial motto for Duke's new role. With a small ID badge around his neck and a well-groomed coat thanks to regular care, Duke began his first shift. Not as a visitor, but as a therapy dog. Each morning, he walked the halls with Claire, through the children's wing, the post-op recovery rooms, and the elderly ward. A 9-year-old girl who had remained silent for 2 weeks following open-heart surgery giggled for the first time when Duke gently rested his chin on the edge of her bed and nudged her hand with his nose. A teenage boy, suffering from depression after a car accident, spoke for the first time in days after just 3 sessions with Duke. Dr. Grant began calling it the Duke effect, a wordless language no medication could ever replicate. But Duke's impact went beyond emotional comfort. He surprised everyone with the nearly intact instincts of a former K9. Once, while passing by the emergency ward, Duke suddenly stopped, let out a low, urgent whine, and stared fixedly at a monitor near an elderly patient. Moments later, a nurse discovered a blocked IV line, something that could have caused serious complications if not addressed quickly. From then on, Duke was no longer considered a special guest. He was part of the team. The hospital prepared a dedicated rest area for him. A soft bed, fresh water, and a wall of photos with the patients he had accompanied. Children called him Dr. Duke. Adults simply referred to him as the staff member who listens. Linda, the one who had once objected the loudest, was now often the one who took Duke for his lunchtime walks. She still didn't say much during those walks, but sometimes, if you looked closely, you might catch a smile on her face as Duke rested his head on a nearby bench. Like 2 souls, once strangers, now beating to the same quiet rhythm. Sarah frequently brought Tyler back to the hospital, just to say, "Thank you." A gratitude expressed not in words, but in the small boxes of cookies she left in the staff lounge, or in the quiet moments when she and Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor, playing doctor and patient with Duke, who played the patient remarkably well, always lying still and tolerating the toy stethoscope around his neck. One day, during the hospital's anniversary celebration, the director took the stage, rested his hand on Claire's shoulder, and said, "We have brilliant doctors, we have devoted nurses, and we have Duke, not in a lab coat, not with a degree, but who brings something more than miracles. He reminds us that medicine heals the body, but love is what brings people back to life." The applause thundered like a storm. Duke, who had been lying quietly near the front of the auditorium, lifted his head. He didn't understand the words, but when Claire knelt down, leaned in close, and whispered, "You did good, hero," his tail gave a gentle wag, steady, certain, like the heartbeat of every life he had ever touched. A crisp morning greeted them as sunlight streamed through the windows of their modest apartment, nestled within a tranquil neighborhood just a few blocks from the hospital. Gone were the days of rain tapping on rusted tin roofs and wind sneaking through decayed door frames. Now, the gentle chirping of sparrows and the faint aroma of toast from the tiny kitchen filled the air. Sarah stood by the window, cradling a warm cup of tea, her gaze absorbing the familiar scene she once feared lost forever. On the polished wooden floor, Duke lay curled beside the crib, his eyes half closed but ears perked, attuned to every subtle movement of the baby within, ready to spring into action at the slightest sign of distress. Beneath his clean, dry fur, the wound on Duke's leg had healed, leaving only a faint scar that tugged at Sarah's heart each time she noticed it. Their new life unfolded quietly, simply, yet warmly. The apartment, though not spacious, was bright and well-equipped. Every weekend, Claire would visit, bringing along brand-new toys, a bag of cookies, or a carefully selected picture book she would proudly present as hand-picked by Aunt Claire. Some days, she would simply sit beside Sarah, watching Tyler sleep and sharing serene moments with Duke. During these times, Sarah felt truly alive, not merely existing as she had in the past. Duke seemed to embrace this new chapter wholeheartedly. Each Sunday morning, as gentle sunlight filtered through the window, he would position himself beside Tyler's crib. When Tyler stirred, whimpering softly, Duke would nudge the crib with his nose, offering comfort. When the baby giggled, Duke would lift his head, tail wagging gently. A silent bond forming between a seasoned soul and a budding life just beginning to explore the world. Duke was there for Tyler's first steps. As the toddler wobbled along the edge of the sofa, Duke stood vigilantly behind him, a protective barrier against potential falls. When Tyler babbled, "Ma, ma," followed by "do," initially puzzling everyone until Duke responded with a soft bark, the room erupted in laughter. From then on, "Do" became Duke's affectionate nickname, which he bore with evident pride. One evening, as Sarah and Claire sat together on the apartment's small balcony, Sarah confided, "Tyler may not remember these early days, but I will cherish them forever. The times Duke rested his head by the crib, Tyler's tentative steps under Duke's watchful eyes, and the peaceful nights knowing we're no longer alone." To Tyler, Duke was a friend, a first teacher, and an embodiment of courage and devotion. Sarah once observed her son, barely able to walk, mimicking Duke's posture, then nestling his cheek into the dog's soft fur. Duke remained still, offering only a gentle sigh and a tender lick to the boy's hair, a gesture reminiscent of the way he once comforted James. Unspoken but universally understood, Duke was more than a pet. He was a milestone, a witness, and a guardian of a family's journey back to life. Sarah had faced despair, Tyler had teetered on the edge of existence, and Duke had risked everything to hold them together, minute by minute, through a storm no one believed they could survive. Now the path ahead seemed less daunting. Sarah had resumed her journaling, a habit abandoned after James's passing. She chronicled the little things. Tyler finishing an extra spoonful of porridge, Claire bringing a teddy bear dressed as a doctor, and Duke, ever vigilant, as if he vowed never to let his guard down in protecting the treasures he had fought so hard to save. In the heart of a city once engulfed by storms, there stood a modest home where a child grew each day. A mother relearned the art of smiling, and a dog, no longer a K9, no longer a warrior, became a symbol of love, loyalty, and hope. As time gently etched its marks on their journey of renewal, Tyler grew steadily, not in a house filled with material wealth, but in a home brimming with affection. Here, he was met with tender gazes, familiar barks, and the constant presence of a dog he never ceased to follow. The first time Tyler managed to sit up, Sarah nearly burst into tears. The little boy sat wobbling on a thick blanket, arms reaching forward for balance, and the first thing he saw was Duke's warm muzzle resting gently on the edge of the bed. Sarah couldn't tell if Tyler's newfound stability was due to his growing strength or the silent assurance in Duke's eyes, encouraging him to try, because his steadfast companion was right there. As Tyler learned to roll over and crawl, their small home buzzed with newfound energy. He would trail Duke everywhere, from the kitchen to the door, from the living room to the corner where Duke's favorite old rug lay. Tyler didn't cry when he stumbled. Instead, he looked up in search of Duke, and the aging dog, ever patient, would turn back, offering a soft bark as if to say, "Keep going, little one. The journey is just beginning." The day Tyler took his first steps was a crisp spring morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air. Sarah was wiping the table when she heard the soft patter of tiny feet on the wooden floor. Turning around, she saw her son, arms outstretched, tottering forward, with Duke's bushy tail gently wagging behind him, keeping rhythm like a supportive drumbeat. And when Tyler tumbled forward, he didn't wail. Instead, he erupted into giggles as Duke tenderly licked his cheek. As Tyler grew older, Sarah couldn't help but remark, "He's so much like James." The boy never allowed anyone to upset his mother, even if it was just in jest or a fleeting frown. Once, when Claire playfully teased Sarah about dozing off at work, 3-year-old Tyler marched over, stood protectively in front of his mother, hands on his hips like a miniature knight, and declared firmly, "My mom is amazing, don't tease her!" Claire burst into laughter, but Sarah turned away to hide the tears welling up. Not from sadness, but from the profound realization that, for the first time, she felt truly protected, even if her guardian barely reached her waist. To Duke, Tyler was more than just a child. He was a living bridge between past and present, a reason for Duke to continue moving forward despite his aging limbs. And Tyler, with his innocent intuition, seemed to understand this bond. He never tugged on Duke's ears or attempted to ride him like other children might. Instead, he would sit beside him, occasionally placing a small toy on Duke's paw or sharing half a cookie, then laughing gleefully. Time, relentless and unwavering, left its imprint even on those once thought unyielding. Duke, the dog who had braved fierce storms, saved fragile lives amidst torrential rains, and stood guard over sleeping infants, was no longer the robust canine of yesteryears. His once sleek, strong coat now bore streaks of silver along his back and muzzle. The powerful strides had softened into measured, deliberate steps. His eyes still gleamed, but their gaze had mellowed, reflecting a treasure trove of memories only Duke could fathom. Nights of despair, days when the sun returned, moments of lifting his head just to ensure his loved ones were safe. Duke remained with Sarah's family, but his deepest bond was with someone no longer a toddler learning to walk, but a young man nearly as tall as the doorframe. Tyler, now 19, studying veterinary medicine at a nearby university, reserved a special place for Duke in every chapter of his life. Each day, as he headed to class, Tyler brought Duke along in a custom cart he had painted with the words, "Companion to the Silent Teacher." He often joked that Duke was an honorary professor of physiology, since it was Duke who inspired his career path. Yet beneath the humor lay a profound truth. No one had shown Tyler the healing power of love, loyalty, and gentle silence more than Duke. One autumn day, Tyler stood on the small stage of the local bookstore, holding the first book he had ever written, The Hero in the Storm. The room wasn't large, but it was packed. Former nurses from the hospital, teachers, Tyler's classmates, and townspeople who had followed the story years ago through the media. And in the front row, Sarah sat quietly, holding Claire's hand, the woman who had stayed by her side through all the years when no one else had. Tyler bowed his head toward the mic, his voice calm but firm, carrying a maturity far beyond his age. Thank you all for being here today. The story in this book isn't a novel. It's not a piece of fantasy. It's memory. Mine, my mother's, a brave woman named Claire's, and one being who never spoke a word, but saved more lives than 100 voices ever could. He turned his head, eyes searching for Duke, who sat off to the side of the hall on a soft rug that had been set out for him. Duke no longer had the strength to push through a crowd, but he still tracked Tyler's every move, just like he had once shadowed Sarah. Hearing his name, Duke lifted his head. "This is Duke," Tyler said, his voice catching slightly. "The dog who carried me to the hospital on a night when every last light of hope had gone out. The only one beside my mother when my father was lost. The one who taught me my first lesson in loyalty. Not with words, but by never leaving." He pointed to the cover of the book. An illustration of Duke racing across a flooded road, fabric bundle in his mouth, the dim lights of a hospital shining in the distance. "This image isn't just an illustration of an event," he continued. "It's a symbol of those who sacrifice quietly, who never seek recognition or titles, who, be they human or otherwise, simply do what is right because their hearts won't allow them to do anything else." Applause filled the room. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Claire leaned toward Sarah and whispered, "That boy's really grown up." Sarah nodded, squeezing her friend's hand gently, but her eyes never left Tyler. Tyler bowed again. "And my final thanks go to Duke. My hero, thank you for being here, for always being here." At that moment, Duke stood, not quickly, but steadily. He made his way over to Tyler, and when he reached him, he didn't bark or make a sound. He simply rested his head on Tyler's foot, just like he had done when Sarah collapsed with the death notice, when Tyler took his first steps, or when the house was flooding and Duke had been the last solid thing to hold on to. And under the soft lighting of the little bookstore, the entire room went still as they saw Duke's eyes that had weathered storms, still clear, but carrying something deeper than words. Peace. As if he knew. He had fulfilled his life's purpose, not a mission of combat, but a mission of love. After the book launch, no one had expected the story of Tyler and Duke to resonate so widely. The Hero in the Storm became more than just a personal memoir. It became a wake-up call to hearts everywhere, a tribute to loyalty, compassion, and the silent value of beings who had given their best years on the front lines without asking for anything in return. Across the state, families began to open their homes to retired service dogs. People who had once feared or overlooked them now visited rescue shelters, asking to care for these four-legged heroes as a way to say thank you and show they were seen, valued. And right in the very city where the story had begun, a program was born, Back Home with Honor, founded by Tyler himself. The animal rescue center he opened not long after graduating veterinary school stood on the edge of the city's largest park. It had gardens, a training area, and a row of small but well-equipped clinics. At the entrance, a wooden sign hand-carved with care read, "The Duke Center, where love always finds its way home." Beneath it, a small bronze relief depicted a German shepherd standing in the rain, eyes fixed on a distant light. Tyler often told his team, "I didn't just learn medicine at school. I learned it from a teacher who couldn't speak, but healed wounds no doctor could ever see. In his final years, Duke often lingered in the garden behind the rescue center. Though frail with age, he still made his slow way to the gate whenever a new dog arrived, sniffing gently, greeting them like an older brother welcoming someone home. Many of the staff believed Duke had a gift, a way of reading the brokenness in those abandoned animals. And strangely, after Duke approached them, those dogs usually calmed down. They adjusted more easily, became gentler, as if his quiet presence told them, "You're safe now." When Duke took his final breath on a soft spring afternoon, no one wept aloud. Not because the sorrow wasn't deep, but because everyone felt it clearly. Duke hadn't left. He had simply stepped into legend, like the last light lingering in the hearts of all who had once looked into those eyes. During a private memorial, Tyler placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the foot of Duke's small statue in the center's garden. He bowed his head, fingers brushing the engraved name, and whispered, "You saved my mom. You saved me. And now, through every life that walks through these gates, you're still saving others, in the most beautiful way a dog ever could." And so Duke's story didn't end in a stormy night. It began at that very moment, when loyalty was rewritten in actions, when love stopped being a word and became a legacy, when a dog, quietly, unassumingly, changed the world of one person, and then the world itself. Duke's journey isn't just the story of a retired K9 who braved a storm to save a child. It's a symbol of unconditional love, unwavering loyalty, and an instinct to protect that runs deeper than words. In Duke's eyes lived a past shaped by loss, a present defined by quiet strength, and a future lit by hope, not for himself, but for those he loved. Duke never spoke. He never needed praise. But through his steady presence and silent actions, he held a family together and sparked something powerful in an entire community. Do you believe a dog can change the course of someone's life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this inspiring story with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next unforgettable journey. We'll see you soon.